Oh, thank you very much. Hi, everyone, and thanks for attending. Thanks to the Treasure Valley AARP New Knowledge Adventures for hosting this presentation today, and especially to Stephen Ledbetter, Shenna Smith, and Carol Horcade for all their help in coordinating everything. Research for the book, Charlie Bemis, The Life and Times of a Chinese American Pioneer, was supported in part by grants from the Idaho Humanities Council and the University of Idaho's John Calhoun Smith Memorial Fund, and I greatly appreciate their support. Although I disagree with some of the information contained in earlier works about Charlie Bemis, I do not mean to disparage or disrespect them in any way. Previous authors have done an invaluable service in bringing her to our attention and exciting our admiration for her. Although I did locate a few sources that were formerly very obscure or even unknown, most of my information was also available to earlier writers. Where we differ is in how we interpret the research materials available to us. And so now as I go into the presentation, I am going to turn off my video so that you won't be able to see a talking head and instead can focus on the slides. Most of you have probably already heard of the Pacific Northwest's most famous Chinese woman, Charlie Bemis, who lived here for over 60 years. After her parents in China sold her, she was smuggled into this country, purchased by a Chinese man, and brought to Warren, Idaho. She and Charlie Bemis married in 1894 and settled on the remote Salmon River. Charlie died in 1922, and Polly died in 1933. Somehow, excuse me, somehow a legend arose that Charlie Bemis had won her in a poker game. The strange winnings of Charlie Bemis tells how Bemis, playing with a Chinese opponent, supposedly won Polly, whom another author called the slave girl with the skin like whipping cream, the velvet hair, and the smooth, warm thighs. The lack of documentation about Polly's youth in China and her early years in Idaho has led to many other romanticized versions of her life, perpetuating myths about her that are now difficult to dispel. Such fantasies provide few glimpses of Polly's true character and personality and leave readers unable to distinguish the real Polly Bemis from the fictional one. Instead, Polly's actual history is genuinely fascinating, contrasting with the popular perceptions of her that have distorted our understanding of this Chinese woman pioneer. The best known versions of Polly's life are the book and the film, Thousand Pieces of Gold. While they are sympathetic and well-researched portrayals, they unfortunately fictionalize Polly's story to the extent that readers or viewers cannot distinguish the real events and characters from the invented ones. For example, on the book's title page, author Ruth Ann Lum McCunn describes it as a biographical novel that, quote, tells the story of Polly Bemis. A few fictitious characters have been added and certain events transposed for the sake of the narrative, but the essential story of Polly's life remains accurate, end quote. The title, Thousand Pieces of Gold, is the English translation of a term of endearment used by Chinese fathers to refer to their daughters. A dramatic highlight of both the book and the movie occurs when Charlie Bemis and a Chinese man called Hong King play poker for very high stakes, ownership of Polly herself. Most of the other retellings of Polly's life history also state that Charlie Bemis won her in a poker game, and some even insist that she was once a prostitute. Like many of you, I read the book and saw the movie. Both make Polly's story so intriguing that I believed everything. My first indication that the one in a poker game story might not be accurate was in 1988, when I helped a student find information on the Chinese in Idaho for her term paper. The finished paper included the text of an interview she had with her uncle, Herb McDowell, who grew up in Warren and knew Polly when he was a boy. Mr. McDowell stated emphatically, quote, Polly wasn't won in no poker game, end quote. He told how Polly and Lee Dick, a Chinese physician, nursed Charlie back to health after he was shot. Mr. McDowell commented, "They got pretty close, her and Charlie, during this time, and when he got better, they got married just like any other normal people." When the writer asked how McDowell knew this was accurate, he said that Otis Morris had told him, implying that Otis Morris ought to know because he was the stepson of W.J. Kelly, one of the witnesses at the Bemis wedding. It surprised me to learn that Charlie Bemis might not have won Polly in a poker game after all, and I wanted to see if I could learn the truth, but by the time I began investigating, everyone involved had died. In order to separate the truth from myths and legends, I decided to look for what are called primary source materials, meaning that they were written or produced at the time an event occurred. Examples include photographs, census records, newspaper reports, deeds, vital statistics, tax rolls, interviews, letters, and diaries. And this is part of the paper trail that all of us leave behind during our lifetimes. For most of us, that paper trail starts with a birth certificate. For Polly, however, it does not begin until 1880, when that year's United States Census lists her with Charlie Bemis in the town of Washington. Washington and Warrens, with an S, are both old names for Warren. On this page from the 1880 census, Charlie Bemis and Polly appear together. Charlie's first name, Charles, was abbreviated to Chaz, and Polly has no last name listed. You'll see a close-up of their entry in a minute, but first notice that this one shows what information was gathered at that time. Each set of numbers on the left indicates a different household, so they were living together. The next column is for name, then race, sex, age, marital status, occupation, and place of birth. Here's a close-up of Charlie and Polly's entry. He is a white male, age 32, and she's a Chinese female, age 27. Subtracting 27 from 1880 gives 1853 as the year of Polly's birth. Although other documents conflict with that date, it is the one she herself used most consistently, and it's on her gravestone. We'll skip the diagonal marks for now and come back to them later. The occupational column states that Charlie ran a saloon and that Polly was housekeeping, probably just keeping house for him and not yet running a boarding house. The last columns show that Charlie was born in Connecticut, as were his parents, while Polly was born in or near Peking, the old name for Beijing, in northern China. This edition of 1,000 Pieces of Gold has 3 photographs on the cover. Because the one at the upper left appears with the other 2, it gives the impression that it too is a photo of her. Since the identical photo is also used inside the book, many people believe that it depicts Polly Bemis as a child with bound feet. Although Polly did once have bound feet, this is not a picture of her then. The author got it from Berkeley's Bancroft Library. A mistaken assumption led to the photograph being redrawn and used as the cover for a booklet about Polly Bemis. This is another illustration from 1,000 Pieces of Gold. Again, through no fault of the author, some people have gotten the impression that it is of Polly Bemis herself as a prostitute, but it is not. According to a 1921 interview, Polly's parents sold her as a slave girl because they had no food. An old woman smuggled her into Portland and sold her for $2,500 to an unnamed old Chinese man who took her to Warren in a pack train. People are often disappointed to learn that the handsome young Chinese man, Jim, the love interest in both the book and the movie, was one of Ruth Ann Lum McCunn's fictitious characters. A 1923 newspaper interview with Polly states that she arrived in Warren on July 8, 1872. As she alighted from her horse, she was greeted by a stranger who said, "Here's Polly," as he helped her from the saddle, and ever after, Polly was her name. Although her arrival in Warren would have been an unusual event for that community, I have not yet found it mentioned in a newspaper, a letter, or a diary from that time period. Warren itself never had a newspaper, so far as we know, and stories about Warren that appear in other newspapers around that time don't mention it. No original sources name either the Chinese pack train operator who purchased Polly or the Warren Chinese businessman for whom she was intended. While numerous secondary sources state that her Chinese owner's name was Hong King and that he owned a saloon, there is no evidence to show that either statement is true. No Chinese man with that name or that exact occupation appears in any of the documentary sources so far consulted. Although two Warren Chinese dealt in retail liquor in 1870 and 1871, their names were Mai Yik Chung and Yi Yik. Idaho's sister Alfreda Elsenson, who wrote a brief biography of Polly Bemis, used the name Hong King for the Chinese man who owned Polly. However, she herself questioned its existence. In a 1943 letter to a local old-timer, she asked, quote, "Do you know whether there was a Chinese man by that name at Warren's in the early days?" End quote. Can we back up, please, to the 1870 census? Thank you. In order to learn whether any Chinese man in Warren could have afforded to pay $2,500 for a woman, I looked at the 1870 Warren census 2 years before Polly's arrival there. This is a composite page from it. Then the only Chinese man who could have afforded to pay $2,500 for a woman was a 30-year-old placer miner named Ah Young. The word Ah was often used before Chinese first names, so Ah Young meant that person is called Young, with no indication of any last name. He had wealth valued at $3,500. The next wealthiest Chinese man, Ah Hon, a 35-year-old merchant, had a building and possessions worth only $1,900 in 1870. With Han being his first name and no last name given, he might be the Hong King referred to, but that coincidence is not enough to say that his name was Hong King or that anyone in Warren actually had that name. The person who bought Polly in 1872 may not even be in the 1870 Warren census. Perhaps he came later or was not counted. For example, I know Charlie Bemis, who later became Polly's husband, lived in Warren by 1870, but for some reason he's not listed in that year's census. Perhaps he was out of town or mining in a remote area. Polly may have been obliged to work in her owner's business, perhaps as a hostess or dance hall girl. In a later interview, a reporter asked her what she thought of the flapper of today with her rouge and paint, meaning makeup. Polly replied, "I paint like that too all the time till I go to my man. Then I not have to paint anymore. American girl today paint till she gets man too." Let's return to the 1880 census listing Charlie and Polly. Notice the columns with the diagonal marks. If Polly and Charlie were married, they would each have a mark in the middle of the 3 columns. Instead, a mark in the first one indicates that Charlie Bemis was single, while a similar mark in the 3rd column indicates that Polly was a widow. How can we explain the fact that Polly is listed as a widow in the 1880 census? In China, wealthy Chinese men often had more than one wife, as well as one or more concubines. Such a man coming here without his wife might miss female companionship. In that case, he could purchase a woman to be his concubine. He would thus have exclusive use of her services. A woman in that sort of relationship, while not a wife, was like a wife. Therefore, based on the fact that Polly called herself a widow in the 1880 census, I believe that she was purchased as a concubine. If her owner then died or abandoned Polly to return to China, she would have considered herself a widow. By the summer of 1881, Charlie Bemis ran a saloon and a feed stable in Warren. Even though he and Polly were not married, a newspaper story reported that Mrs. Charles Bemis was one of only 4 women in the entire town. In May 1887, the Bemis' house in Warren burned down. The Idaho County Free Press newspaper reported the loss is considerable. $500 in greenbacks were consumed and several costly gold watches belonging to various parties and other jewelry worth about $2,000. All the provisions, household furniture, etc. went up in smoke. By early September, Charlie had rebuilt his house. It is the white one on the left, and it may also have served as his saloon. This 1889 tax assessment roll indicates that C.A. Bemis had improvements in Warren valued at $275, probably his house and business, and stock in trade valued at $750, which was probably the liquor for his saloon. Then on September 16, 1890, Charlie was the victim of a shooting affray. His assailant, Johnny Cox, thought Bemis owed him some money, which Bemis refused to pay. Although Cox intended to shoot out Bemis's eye, the ball shattered his cheekbone instead. By the end of October, Charlie was doing well. The Idaho County Free Press editor visited him and found him sitting up and dressed and able to talk and smoke, but looking ghastly with that horrible bullet hole through his face. Although that account did not mention Polly, a 1923 interview credited her with being the person who nursed him back to health after weeks of faithful care. In 1893, a newspaper story said that Warren's population was about 100 Euro-Americans and 75 Chinese men and 1 Chinese woman, who of course was Polly. Charles Bemis, who formerly ran the hotel, then had a private boarding house and also a stable. Polly probably ran the boarding house for him, since in 1924, she said that Jay Cizik was one of her boarders 32 years before, or about 1892. She also told how she silenced the miners who complained about her coffee by appearing with a butcher knife and the question, "Who no like my coffee?" On August 13, 1894, Polly and Charlie were married at Charlie's residence in Warren. Their marriage certificate is now at the Historical Museum at St. Gertrude in Cottonwood, Idaho. Justice of the Peace A.D. Smead performed the ceremony, witnessed by W.J. Kelly and George L. Patterson. Between 1864 and 1887, Idaho had miscegenation laws, making it a misdemeanor for any Euro-American person to intermarry or cohabit with any African-American, Native American, or Chinese person. By 1887, the law only prohibited marriages between Euro-Americans and African-Americans, so Polly and Charlie had a legal marriage. In 1921, however, in response to Japanese immigration into Idaho, quote, Mongolians, unquote, were added back in as another prohibited group. This racist law was not repealed until 1959. Even though Polly Bemis was married to an American citizen, United States law did not allow her or any other Asian immigrants to become naturalized citizens until the law was repealed for Chinese people in 1943, 10 years after Polly's death. Under the terms of the renewed Chinese Exclusion Act, Polly Bemis had to apply for a certificate of residence, showing that she was legally entitled to live in the United States. Following a court hearing, Judge Beatty ordered that Polly Bemis be granted a certificate of residence. This is the certificate that was issued to Polly on August 10, 1896. The issuing office was in Helena, Montana, and the certificate was probably mailed to her. Soon after Polly and Charlie's marriage in August 1894, they took up a mining claim and moved down to the south side of the Salmon River, about a 17-mile trip from Warren. For the next few years, there is almost nothing known about their lives. In November 1902, however, the Bemuses begin to be mentioned in what are known as the Shep Diaries. Charles Shep, shown here, had a mining claim across the river and several miles away up in the mountains. Shep wrote daily entries in small pocket diaries. He often came down to purchase produce from the ranch at the mouth of Crooked Creek across the river from the Bemuses. This was a popular Salmon River crossing point. Shep's first mention of either of the Bemuses is on November 8, 1902, when he states Bemus over this AM. And from then until Polly's death in 1933, his diary entries tell us a great deal about the Bemuses. Shep writes about the Bemuses' personal possessions, their garden and what they planted, and their ranch buildings. Like neighbors anywhere, they helped each other out and entertained one another. For example, on November 20, 1902, Shep wrote, "Went over river after dinner, and dinner is always the noon meal. Got parsnips and onions. Invited to Thanksgiving dinner the 27th. Fine day. January 15, 1903. Over the river today, crossed on the ice. Bemus and Polly, sick with colds, got jar tomatoes. Fine day, clear. October 7, 1905. Someone down from Warren brought a dog for Polly. April 21, 1906. Robinson back from Concord. He brought word that San Francisco was destroyed by earthquake. February 22, 1908. At Bemis's, fixed sewing machine. This sewing machine head at the Idaho State Historical Museum in Boise came from Polly Bemis's first Salmon River cabin. Besides sewing, Polly enjoyed crocheting and other kinds of needlework. Examples of both are at the Historical Museum at St. Gertrude in Cottonwood and in her restored Salmon River home. April 4, 1908, got bucket eggs from Polly. June 23, 1908, down to river at Bemis's all night, had strawberries, paid Polly $5.50 for eggs and dried fruit. Although Charlie Bemis didn't have an income, Polly had some money saved from when she worked in Warren, and she made additional money from selling fruit, vegetables, and eggs. February 6, 1910, took picture of Polly and Nellie and Julie. Nellie and Julie were the horses. In 1910, Shep bought the ranch at the mouth of Crooked Creek, and he and his mining partner, Peter Klinkhammer, began living there. They and the Bemuses often visited back and forth. August 17, 1910, Polly and Bemus over to dinner. Polly caught 27 fish. In later years, Pete Klinkhammer commented, Polly loved to fish and was good at it. We'd see her gardening and she'd bend to the earth real quick, then shove something into the big pocket of her long dress. Come 3 o'clock every day, Polly had her gardening done and her fish bait ready and waiting in her pocket. We used to know what time it was by watching her. August 17, 1910, Bear been eating Bemis's apples. Had watermelon at Bemis's. Fine day. July 18, 1911, Pete back this afternoon. Got cat for Polly. Occasionally, there's unintended humor in the diaries. One sequence starts on January 7, 1912. Put George in chicken house. On January 8, Shep killed George. He weighed 4 pounds. Then on Sunday, January 21, Shep wrote, Bemis and Polly over to dinner. Cooked George with noodles. November 6, 1912. I came home, brought down shoes for Polly, and these shoes were found in the cabin after she died. Earlier, on April 29, 1912, Shep wrote, mail from Nellie, his sister. First heard of the loss of the Titanic by hitting an iceberg. August 14, 1914, Pete back this evening, got phonograph and records. This is a list of some of Shep's records. Pete Klinkhammer recalled that one record concerned a Chinese laundryman, and Uncle Josh's troubles invariably made Polly chuckle. September 6, 1915, over the river this evening, sent to Montgomery Ward for shoes for Polly and got her order for grub. August 11, 1919, over river, fixed telephone. Shep had installed a battery-operated telephone between their two places and later ran the line on his side up over the mountain to town. September 6, 1919, boat down with 9 men. They stopped here tonight. Captain Harry Gulicki, shown here, piloted the boat. Passenger Will Shoup said, another interesting character was Charles Bemis, who has lived with a Chinese wife on a little 4-acre patch of land on Polly Creek for the past 25 years, meaning since 1894. He is getting too old to work, and Polly, the wife, does it all. On Polly's birthday, September 11, 1920, Shep wrote, over river to dinner, Polly, 67 years old. China Sam at Bemis's tonight. Fine day. Subtracting 67 from 1920 again gives 1853 as the year of Polly's birth. The Euro-Americans called this man China Sam, but his real name was Zheng Chu. He ran a bathhouse in Warren and was one of Polly's friends from when she lived there. On July 21, 1921, Shep wrote, boat down this evening. On this trip, again captained by Harry Gulicki, one of the passengers was Sissy Patterson, also known as Countess Eleanor Geisica. In 1923, an account of her visit with Polly Bemis appeared in the magazine Field and Stream, and it's the first known interview with Polly. The Countess wrote, "Polly stands not much over 4 feet, neat as a pin, wrinkled as a walnut, and at 67 she is full of dash and charm. Polly told the Countess, 'I cost $2,500, don't look it now, and chuckled. The Countess asked Polly where Mr. Bemis was, and she said, abed. He been abed most 2 year now.' When Polly indicated that Charlie was pretty cross and implied that she had to wait on him a lot, the Countess suggested that maybe Polly should get another husband. He, she laughed. Yes, I think so too." With Charlie Bemis bedridden, Charlie Shep and Pete Klinkhammer increasingly took over many of the Bemis' chores. During 1921, for example, Shep wrote that they crossed the river many times to cut wood for the Bemises, put out a stovepipe fire, plow and plant their garden, burn brush, cut hay, and do the watering. Captain Gulicki's trips almost always stopped so his passengers could visit with Polly and take photos. This is the July 1922 R.E. Shepherd party from Twin Falls. Captain Gulicki is on the left and Polly, then 68 years old, is in front. One of the men on the trip kept a diary. His entry for Wednesday, July 19, 1922 reads, quote, "About 5 p.m. we stopped at Polly Bemis's place. Bemis is an old timer here, probably 75 years old and confined to his bed. His wife, Polly, is a Chinese woman. She looks after him and tends to the garden, orchard, and farming operations. Polly has been in the Salmon River country for more than 40 years and has never been off the ranch for 28 years, end quote. Then less than a month later, on August 16, 1922, with Pete away taking produce to Dixie, Shep wrote that the Bemis' house burned at 12 noon. Had a hell of a time. Got the old man out by the skin of my teeth. Lost Teddy, that was Polly's dog. He got burned. Polly and I got the old man over the river about 4. Had hard time. Didn't save a single thing. The whole place was on fire when I got over." In a 1924 interview, Polly said that she lost one of her most cherished possessions, a blue silk dress about 35 years old with rows of buttons made by her husband from $2.50 and $5 gold pieces. The silk was sent into the camp from San Francisco and was lined with flour sacks from Grangeville. Although the dress burned, Polly later recovered the buttons. On October 29, Charlie Bemis died. Shep wrote in the margin, I think we're out of sync here. We need to go one more, please. Yes, thank you. Shep wrote in the margin, Bemis dead, and underlined it for emphasis. Bemis passed in at 3 a.m., up to camp, left at 5 a.m. Gus and Holmes down. We buried the old man right after dinner. Fine day. This is Charlie Bemis's grave at the Shep Ranch. Since Polly surely helped choose his final resting place, it is not surprising to find that it is in a nearly ideal setting with respect to the Chinese principles of feng shui. There, the ideal location for a grave is in the center of a south-facing slope overlooking a body of water, preferably a meandering stream or river. A curving south-facing hillside embraces Charlie Bemis's grave, which would still face the river if modern buildings did not intervene. On October 31, Shep wrote, Polly going to Warren. She went up with Pete the next day and would live there for nearly 2 years. While she was there, Shep wrote to her occasionally. Although Polly could not read or write, she had many friends in Warren who surely read the letters to her and who probably wrote down replies that she dictated. Pete Klinkhammer later said, Bemis started to teach her to read once, but she got along too well and he quit. It wouldn't have taken her very long if he'd been willing to put out the effort. In July 1923, Charlie Shep's sister Nellie and brother Harvey came for a long visit. When they left in August, they went back through Warren. There, a car took them and Polly to Grangeville. Nellie and Polly had their photograph taken along the way. In Grangeville, the Idaho County Free Press interviewed Polly. Described as a little old gray-haired woman weighing less than 100 pounds, Polly wore boys' shoes on her tiny feet, bound in childhood, and wore a plain cotton dress. Polly had many callers during the week at the home of Mrs. Anson Holmes, where she is a guest. She came here from Warren by automobile in order to be fitted with glasses. She also had some dental work done. Polly took her first automobile ride and saw her first train, but her first motion picture fascinated her the most. After a week in Grangeville, Polly returned to Warren on the Salmon River stage. "I have best time in 50 years, she exclaimed. "Maybe I come back next year." Bedecked in a new dress, a gay hat, and white shoes, Polly was particularly proud of her new gold-rimmed spectacles. Shep and Klinkhammer agreed to build Polly a new house and look after her. In exchange, they would get the ranch on her death. Between October 1923 and May 1924, Shep often wrote about sawing the house logs, putting them up, cutting shakes for the roof, putting in a new telephone, installing flooring, and constructing windows. In the meantime, Polly kept busy in Warren. She was always very fond of children and reportedly knew the name of every child born in Warren and the date of its birth. Johnny Carey was a very special young friend. He grew up to write several books, one of which was River of No Return with Court Conley. Johnny, his parents, Tom and Jeannie, and his two sisters, Gay and Mary, lived on the South Fork of the Salmon River. In order to go to school, the children had to live in Warren away from home. Johnny stayed at a hotel, but when his next younger sister, Gay, started school, she lived with Polly that term. Johnny helped Polly with chores, such as bringing in wood. In August 1924, Polly visited Boise. She went with Jay Sizik and his wife, and they stayed at the Idaho Hotel. "Sizik eat in my boarding house 32 years ago. I know him long time," she said. In Boise, Polly saw her first streetcar, her first high building, her second movie show, and rode in her first elevator all in one day. A reporter interviewed her at the Idaho Hotel. Polly at 70 was then a tiny woman with iron gray hair, the brightest of eyes, dressed in a blue cotton dress, her whole appearance scrupulously neat. Her speech is excellent with just enough of the pidgin English to make it fascinating. Her memory is remarkable, particularly for dates, and her eyes twinkle as she tells jokes on herself. After Polly returned to Warren, construction activities increased on her Salmon River house. By September 1924, Charlie Shep was over there nearly every day working on it. On October 8, Pete went to Warren, and on the 9th, he came back with Polly. She stayed with them across the river for just over a week until they finished and finally moved in on Friday, October 17, 1924. This is the interior of her restored cabin, but only a few of the things were actually hers. Charlie Shep built a bed for Polly as well as a table and chairs, and Pete cut firewood for her. As she became older, Shep and Klinkhammer did more and more of the heavy work. Polly still kept very busy. In one 2-week period during 1926, she killed 4 porcupines. We'll just have to imagine how she did it, since the diary doesn't detail her method. Despite being unable to read or write, Polly sometimes got mail. It waited at the nearest post office for Pete Klinkhammer to collect when he took produce into town to sell. In later years, a friend asked Pete if Polly could read. Pete replied, "Could Polly read? Money and 15 too. She was a sharp gambler in a cribbage game and used to pit her wits against the best of them. 2 fellows once came and camped across Crooked Creek and did some placer mining over there. One of them liked to make a big show. He used to get vegetables and a few little things from Polly. She never charged for the stuff, but he kept flashing this $100 bill to show off, I think. Well, Polly let it pass a few times. Then one day she got tired of this and she surprised him. 2 things Polly could do good: count money and 15 too. She changed it for him. After that, he didn't flash no more money." Then on Friday, August 4, 1933, Shep went across the river in the morning and found Polly laying outside. She is bughouse, meaning insane, and nearly helpless. Shep managed to get Polly across the river and cared for her in his home. 2 days later, Pete and a friend took her halfway out on horseback, where they met a car sent from Grangeville to get her. The following Friday, Shep learned that Polly was getting along fine. She probably had had a stroke. Through all the Shep Diaries and the newspaper stories and in the interviews with Polly herself, there's absolutely no mention of Polly being won in a poker game. One of the first published references to it occurred in 1933 when she was in the Grangeville Hospital. A newspaper account related that Cizik explodes myth of Chinese poker bride, suggesting instead that an Indian girl named Molly was the real poker bride. On November 5, 1933, reporter Lamont Johnson, writing for the Sunday Oregonian, published a lengthy article with sensational headlines. Old China woman of Idaho famous, Polly Bemis seriously ill in Grangeville Hospital, career nearly ended. Patient denies that she was won in poker game by man who later married her. On November 6, 1933, Polly Bemis died in the Grangeville Hospital. She was just over 80 years old. Her death certificate lists cause of death as chronic myocarditis, which is defined as the inflammation of the muscular part or myocardium of the heart wall. Polly passed away this afternoon. Shep underlined this entry to emphasize its importance. Polly was buried 2 days later. Neither Shep nor Klinkhammer could attend, and instead Shep wrote that he got one deer today, pretty big. Over the next few weeks, Shep crossed the river to get things, sugar, flour, and even a bed, presumably the one he had made for Polly. He also fed her cat, Johnny. By January 1934, he no longer saw Johnny across the river, and in February he wrote, "Over river PM, I guess Johnny is gone." There's an unsolved puzzle with regard to Polly Bemis. She's often called La Lu, but where did that name come from? It does not appear in any of the newspaper accounts, in the interviews with Polly, or in the Shep Diaries. Its earliest occurrence seems to be in 1947 in Volume 1 of Sister Alfreda Elsonson's Pioneer Days in Idaho County. There she states, quote, "As previously indicated in the certificate of marriage, her Chinese name was La Lu Nathoy," end quote. Here is that certificate again, but as you can see, the name La Lu is not mentioned. I have not yet learned where Sister Alfreda found the name La Lu. Even the surname Nathoy is questionable. The letter could be an N or an H, and it does not appear anywhere else in the document. In fact, when Polly's marriage was recorded at the Idaho County Courthouse in 1894, the recorder copied her surname as Hathoy with an H. Since neither Nathoy nor Hathoy is a Chinese name, this word may be an approximation of the Chinese name Ah Toy. Over the years until his death in 1970, Pete Klinkhammer gave many of Polly's personal possessions to the Historical Museum at St. Gertrude in Cottonwood in care of Sister Alfreda Elsonson. In June 1987, Polly's restored home on the Salmon River was dedicated as a museum. Her remains were removed from Grangeville's Prairie View Cemetery and reburied adjacent to her restored home. So she is across the river from her husband, who is still buried at the Shep Ranch. Her tombstone reads, Polly Bemis, September 11, 1853, November 6, 1933. Because Euro-American people selected her gravesite, it lacks the feng shui characteristics of her husband's. Therefore, ironically, Charlie's gravesite is more typically Chinese than Polly's is. I hope I have persuaded you to be more skeptical of some of the supposed facts about Polly Bemis's life, particularly the one in a poker game legend, the name Hong King for Polly's owner, and even the name La Lu for Polly. Finally, people often ask me, what makes Polly Bemis so famous? I think it is because she represents all the forgotten Chinese women who came to the United States during the late 19th century. Women who arrived often unwillingly, without knowing English, and with no prospect of ever returning home. While here, these women faced racial prejudice from Euro-American people and sexual discrimination from Chinese men. Polly Bemis lived in Idaho for over 60 years. During that time, her strength of character enabled her to rise above adversity, winning respect and admiration from everyone who knew her. Despite the ambiguities and contradictions about Polly's life that still remain, there is one thread that joins all the sources together. In one way or another, they have all said, Polly was a wonderful person, and everybody loved her. For several years, I led a University of Idaho enrichment and summer school class up the Salmon River by jet boat to visit Polly's home and the 2 graves, where we tried to recapture the spirit of this remarkable pioneer woman. Perhaps someday you too can join me, going up the river of no return, back into the past. Thank you, and thank you for letting us into your homes.
All right. Thank you so much. What a fascinating woman. I was going to ask if one might visit her home, so it sounds like that is a possibility.
I'm trying to unmute myself. There we go. Okay. It is a possibility. You have to arrange with, well, there's a couple of ways to do it, main ways. You can either arrange with an outfitter in Riggins to take you up there, or if you get a, that's on a jet boat, or you can float down the river from the Salmon area.
All right. Okay. Are there any questions? There are wonderful reviews in the chat box. I don't see any questions yet. If any of you have questions, please type them now so that we can ask them. I wish I could have met Polly.
Oh, well, I do too. I do too. Yeah. And I know Sister Alfreda Elsenson wrote about her, but as far as we know, Sister Alfreda never met her either. Oh, yeah. Okay. Just last night, just by coincidence, I saw the there's a remastered version of 1,000 Pieces of Gold that is available on Blu-ray, and I purchased that. And here in Moscow, I was able to rent the Kenworthy Theater for a maximum of 20 people, and we showed the video last night. And the reason for doing this was at the end of April, the last week in April, there'll be an archaeological excavation there, which will be run by a University of Idaho graduate student. And so the student and her and the young people, so there's some undergraduate students who will be working on the excavation. So the idea was to have them come and see this film, and they're all reading the book as well. And then in addition to them, I invited a few other people that I knew were interested.